All right, welcome back to Criminology. Now we're looking at Chapter 3, Victims and Victimization. Now this chapter looks at crime from the perspective of the victim. For many years, victims were simply passive participants in the criminal justice system. Now, one of the Crown witnesses against an accused person. Today, criminologists have a far greater understanding of the impact of the criminal victimization can have. This includes economic loss, subsequent victimization by the criminal justice system, long-term stresses that often doesn't end just because the criminal justice system process ended, and ongoing fear of being a repeat offender, and even a demonstration of increased antisocial behavior by the victim as a result of victimization. Now we can start first by defining what is victimology. Victimology is the study being science in this instance, so the study of a scientific study of the victim's role in criminal events. Now that doesn't sound like it makes sense. Why would the victim contribute to their own victimization? We're going to find out something about that. In Canada, the victims' right movement was a movement that was growing out of the feminist movement in the 1960s. Now the 1960s was the woman's second wave of the women's movement. There was a lot of consciousness raising of the social conscious of North America and Europe. And so the victims' right movement came right along with that in a response at that time to the growing amount of domestic violence and sexual assault. Through the 1980s and 90s, many victim services began to emerge. Services like Victims of Violence, the Canadian Resource Centre for Victims of Crime, victim assistance programs. We have one in Owen Sound. I volunteered there for many years, doing training for their volunteers on listening skills. It was research in the 1960s that highlighted the role of victims in the criminal incidents. Results looked at both the direct and the indirect roles of victims. So now let's consider the problem of crime victims. Victims and victimization research data are primarily sourced from the General Social Survey, the victimization study, and that's what we talked about last week. The resulting data have given rise to the recognition of interesting patterns and trends that can help criminologists, the criminal justice system, and society to better understand the nature of victimization and to create policies and support services that best serve the needs of crime victims. So now let's explore some of the effects of victimization, and we're going to explore and consider economic loss, system abuse, long-term stressors, fear, and antisocial behavior. Just one sec. Gotta have a coffee break. There we go. All right. Now there are three categories that the cost to the victim can fit into. There's economic costs. Then there's the costs associated with bringing criminals to the justice system. And then thirdly, the pain and suffering along with diminished quality of life for the victims. Now it's critical to remember that all data that is used to assist is based on incomplete data. And that's an important feature. It's incomplete because it only records the crimes that have been reported. So if crime is not reported, it doesn't get captured. Only 1/3 of crime is reported. Now it's difficult, therefore, to establish an accurate representation of crime in Canada. However, we can still report on what we do know. And so that's what that element is. Then next we can look at the economic loss. With crime that could be property loss or damage, lost wages for being off work, medical related costs. These costs and expenses are one's victim will experience immediately and over the long term. Now, system abuses. What do we mean by system abuses? What system? Well, policing, the courts, and the corrections system are all part of this justice system, and it's designed to assist. However, the justice system can inflict further suffering. Now, this can occur early, at a police interview, and how they conduct that interview with a victim can be very debilitating or very supportive, or at many other steps in this service provision, where there will be contact with, people with either a lot of skill or very little skill, where this could result in re-victimization, and it's a definite risk and some experience around learning how to use good, effective listening skills. Now, the next area we can look at is what's known as the long-term stress, or long-term stressors, and many victims, regardless of some help being available, suffer long-term emotional and psychological harm. Now, there's a misunderstood term, one that is often not all that common into victimization, is PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. But the misunderstanding is that it's associated with those who have been at war or at some other sort of significant conflict. However, PTSD can and does result from other stressors in many forms of victimization, including assaults. Other psychological disorders can also be manifested in a form of victimization, from depression, OCD, or other anxiety-based disorders. Now, I've mentioned also that fear is one of those available components, and fear is related to the long-term stresses. Is it the reality that many victims continue to live in this fear following victimization, even after some healing? Fear for some may act as a trigger for PTSD. And then what about those victims who, as a result of either where they've lived or how they've been raised, produce some of their own antisocial behavior? Well, criminologists have mounted evidence that some victims may be more likely to commit a crime themselves. Those in particular who in their youth experienced abuse, neglect, may have an increased likelihood of smoking and drinking, consuming drugs, and becoming involved in crime. Now, we can look at the cycle of violence, which shows an increased likelihood that boys and girls were more likely to participate in violent behavior if, one, they were a target of physical abuse, or two, exposed to violent behavior among the adults they know or live with, or exposed to weapons. You'll see that on figure 3.2 in your text. It's worth noting that patterns identified in victimization surveys findings are both stable and repetitive, and that suggests that victimization is a function of various personal and ecological factors, and we'll get into that in a moment. Some of the most important patterns and trends in victimization fall into the following categories. Now, here's where the ecology comes in. Social ecology, and we'll break these down in a minute. Social ecology, victim households, victim characteristics, and victims and their criminals. Now, let's look at see how these might contribute to a victim's victimization. Your social ecology, this would be such things as your lifestyle choices and the neighborhood characteristics in which you live. You see the graphic beside me here. It represents the levels of social ecology. There's the individual level, and that's our personal characteristics that may contribute to being victimized or engage in some degree of criminal behavior. And then there's the interpersonal level, and this speaks to who our peers are and the other such influences in our lives. The third level, this represents the organizational level. Now, this is the influence of where we live, our communities, the services that we have in our communities, the types of stores and things that we have in our area. And then the last level is the societal level. And this includes all of our social norms that we adhere to, our beliefs, and any policies introduced by the government. Now, what role does the victim's household? Well, such things as household income, your residence choices, what type of residence are you living in? The victim's household is related to social ecology, as it too considers where one lives. That's your neighborhood, of course, and community. Also introduces what role income may have on the increased risk or the reducing of risks. Again, including where one chooses to live and whether that's an apartment, a single-family home, a tenement. What about anything that might be personal characteristics, the victim characteristics? Can they contribute? Well, such things as your gender, your age, your mental health, social status, marital status, race, ethnicity, whether you've been a victim in the past, can all contribute to whether or not you are going to be a victim or be re-victimized. And we're going to look at some of these. We'll look at gender, age, mental health. So, gender. Women are more likely to be victims than men. Physical assault, sexual assault, and robbery are the three most common sources of victimization. For men, it's physical assault and robbery, whereas sexual assault was among the lowest crime of victimization. Now, age, we already know that we tend to age out. But what about as victims? That's for aging out as crime. Well, age is a significant element with the highest victimization rates to violence between the ages of 20 and 24. And it decreases slowly with age. You'll find that on figure 3.3 in your text. Now, mental health, this is a curious one, because this isn't about what you've been diagnosed with by a health professional. When we self-assess our mental health as good, so that's our perception of our own mental health, and that's a good measure in its own right. If we measure it as good, we are less likely to be victimized. About 10% of our self-reports to the GSS on victimization report a mental health related disability. So people are self-diagnosed around a developmental disorder, a learning disability, or some sort of mental health as being poor. And therefore, when they do identify that way, they are about 4 times more likely to report victimizations. They are at greater risk significantly. All right, what about social status then? Those who live in the lowest income level and associated influences are more likely to be victims of sexual and physical assaults. More affluent citizens, they may be more targets to personal theft. Does marital status play a role? Those never married, separated, or divorced, whether you're male or female, are victimized more than those who are married. Pays to get married, I guess. Race and ethnicity. In 2017, a little less than half, 43% of all police reported hate crimes were motivated by hatred of race or ethnicity. Unfortunately, being a visible minority is a notable feature of victimization. Now, the last little element is around this repeat victimization. Yes, prior experience or experiences as a victim have significantly more risk to being a crime victim again than those who have never been a victim. Now, this is speculation. There's no proof that some personal characteristics may contribute to re-victimization. For example, shy, physically weak individuals or socially isolated individuals may be more prone to bullying and may be at more risk. Now, please remember, there's no guarantee. That is to say, just because one is shy doesn't mean they will be bullied or the person will be a reoffended individual. Criminologists have identified 3 specific characteristics that increase the potential for victimization. Target vulnerability. So how vulnerable are you? Target gratifiability and target antagonism. So let's have a look. The relationship of the victim to the offender. Well, this is interesting, as the data is suggesting that some sort of relationship between the victim and the criminals. So for example, sexual assaults are more frequently between known individuals. That is, the sexual assault victims knows their perpetrator, whether that be a family member, an acquaintance, a friend, or other known relationship. It used to be back in my younger years, it was always fear of stranger danger, but there really never was data that supported the notion that victimization by family was strangers weren't the perpetrators, it was people we knew. Since the commencement of research focusing on victimization, some criminologists have used the resulting data to develop victimization theories. Now there's 3 main categories of victimization theories discussed in the text. And victim participation theory is one. This is the belief that victims may initiate, either actively or passively, the confrontation that leads to their own victimization. And you'll see some of those definitions on page 64. Lifestyle theories. These suggest that crime is not a random occurrence, but rather a function of the victim's lifestyle. And then routine activities theory. This views that the victim's results from the intersection of 3 key variables: the availability of a suitable target, the absence of any capable guardian, and the presence of a motivated offender. Now, these theories are useful for identifying, explaining, and potentially predicting various aspects of victimization process. So let's look at victim participation theory. This is the first one. The basic premise is that the victim may initiate, actively or passively, as I mentioned, the confrontation that leads to their own victimization. Now, with data collected from so many years, some theorists began to recognize that some victims had more involvement than just being a victim. Now, this was quite a novel view, an unusual view, a unique view. When it was first addressed, why would anyone ask or initiate the circumstances to become a victim? Well, there was 2 forms, the active and passive. Active participation. This is where an individual confronts or threatens another first. The research that supports the victim role also addressed what we know as blame the victim. Now, this is where we will attach some degree of blame for the attack on something the victim may have said or done that was interpreted as asking for it. That's not the way that's supposed to work. Blaming the victim. That's putting the blame on the victim when it was the act of assault, say, or sexual assault that is the problem. Nobody asks for that. Active participation can also include incidents of suicide by cop. Now, this is where an individual will antagonize police in an effort to provoke an officer-involved shooting. Passive participation. Here, the focus is on the characteristics, things that are about us that we don't necessarily act and behave in a certain way. These can be personal or social, that make the person an attractive target for criminals. For example, hate crimes. The characteristic of color can be the provocation of criminal behavior. And so there's nothing that anybody did, it was passive. Lifestyle theories. This is the second grouping of victimization theories. Essentially, this theory suggests that our risks to being a victim are connected to our lifestyle. Do you frequently go out at night, frequent the pubs, drink, maybe do a few drugs? These activities or these attributes are choices of lifestyle that we make that may be putting ourselves at some additional risk. It doesn't guarantee anything, but it does put us at additional risk. Now, there are two theories that sort of fall under this lifestyle group. There's the high-risk lifestyles. This one is the sort of self-explanatory, really. You can imagine, you engage in high-risk lifestyle, you are at higher risk of victimization. That makes sense. This risk we're talking about can be someone who lives predominantly on the street, young runaways, teen runaways, or in neighborhoods that we frequent that are a higher risk. These lifestyle risks continue, and as young adults, the risk can include additional drinking, partying, and drugs. Now, the second type is what's known as a deviant place theory. Now, this theory is much more location-based rather than just lifestyle. If an individual lives in a socially disorganized, high-crime area, they are at greater risk, irregardless of whatever behavior or lifestyle you choose. Now, these places are densely populated with much transient population. That's people moving in and moving out or moving to different residents in the same neighborhood, and are in and around commercialized / residential areas. So there's abandoned buildings and things like that, and places of more crime and risks. Now, the third grouping of victimization theories are routine activities theories. Now, this theory considers that victimization is a result of three everyday factors: a suitable target, absence of suitable guardianship, and presence of a motivated learner, or motivated offender. Well, offender. See that on page, I don't know what page it is right off the top of my head, but figure 3.5. And you can see by the graphic, all three elements contribute to victimization. A suitable target. Well, there are suitable targets: unlocked homes, or an unlocked car, or items to steal that are easy to see and carry and to transport. Secondly, capable guardian is missing. This is about the lack of a capable guardian, whether there's a police presence, homeowners that keep an eye open in the neighborhood, friends and relatives or neighbors or your family. And then thirdly, the motivated offender. The presence of a motivated offender willing and able to commit crimes. Now, as you may have noticed, and I hope you did, there's some similarities with routine activities and lifestyle, in that both are pointing about our living arrangements as a significant risk factor. They both rely on four basic concepts: the proximity to criminals, time of exposure to criminals, target attractiveness, and guardianship. They also share many predictions about people's increased risk to victimization, with living in high crime areas, going out late at night, carrying valuables, engaged in risky behavior like drinking, and are without others with them to look out for them. So next, we're going to consider the caring for victims. What do we do to support them? And as stated in your text, victim surveys inform us that almost every Canadian over the age of 15 will one day become a victim of crime. Therefore, helping victims cope with being victims becomes very important. This support to victims can include law enforcement agencies, courts, and correctional and human services. All have come to realize that due process and human rights exist not only for the criminal defendant, but also for the victim of criminal behavior. Canada has had and continues to create and alter existing legislation to support in support of victims. In addition, of course, so does the criminal code continue to be upgraded to reflect new learnings and innovations. Victim service programs in Canada are wide and varied, and at different levels of government. They're at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels. And we're going to review a few so you'll be familiar. Victim compensation. Financial aid applied for by victims to compensate them for different losses or injury that may have resulted from being a victim. This means it can pay for medical bills, lost wages, and future earnings that may be lost, as well as some additional counseling. There are court services. Now, this includes the services of Victim Witness Assistant Programs, the VWAP, and they can provide counseling, referrals to other agencies, support, and preparation for court, for bail hearings, and dates. Often, in domestic violence cases, it's the VWAP counselor that will join the police on the call to provide support to a victim as early as they can. Public education. Public education is really important. It's a common approach to education of the public with primary prevention strategies. Now, primary prevention strategies are to educate people before they become a victim. This teaches things like conflict skills, conflict resolution skills, interpersonal skills. And then there's things like crisis intervention. Now, this support is critical and can direct victims to derive from ranges of treatment options of long-term assistance, food, shelter, medical care, and particular attention to crisis intervention. And this is another area of the VWAP. Victim offender reconciliation programs. Now, these are face-to-face dynamics between victim and offender, and this was first initiated in around 1974, I believe. There is an indigenous approach that's very similar to this, and it's all revolving around restorative justice. And it's also adopted by the federal government. This chapter continues with a discussion of advocacy of victims' rights, outlining and discussing the major principles included in the Canadian Statement of Basic Principles of Justice for Victims and Crime, victim rights legislation, and efforts that individuals can make to avoid being a victim of crime. In 2015, the Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights received royal assent, which provides victims with certain rights to access to information, protection, participation, and restitution in a complaint process for breaches in victims' rights. Now, lastly, we're going to look at some of the efforts that we can utilize to avoid victimization. And the first thing that we'll touch on is what's known as target hardening. Now, this just means that we can make efforts to crime-proof our homes. Maybe it's the quality of locks that we're using, alarm systems, cameras, signs up indicating that things are being recorded. These are doing our own due diligence. This is going to help in the long run. Community organizations are also there to help. Block parenting, neighborhood patrols, better lighting, speed bumps in residential areas can all help, although the research is not really sure just how much it helps. What about technology? Is there technology that we could consider? Well, the online support from many, there is online support from many, and it's varied. Things from games to prepare children for court appearances. And there are many videos of support for such issues as elder abuse, intimate partner violence, and scams. But of course, the difficulty can be locating authoritative videos for this information. Now, of course, we do have 911 technology to assist and other apps that can help with many different victim issues. Now, this was a quick overview I hope it was helpful. This completes our review of Chapter 3, Victims and Victimization. For the next few weeks, we're going to start covering different theories of crime. Next week, we're going to start with choice theory, because they want to. All right, everybody. Keep up the good work, and we'll see you next week. Bye now.